your mics are muted. And I will again reiterate that there is a layout button onto the right side of your screen, right top of your screen. In that layout button, you can select focus. If you select focus, the screen would prominently display the speaker. So that is the best option that can be chosen.
Okay, ciao.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome for the second session of the day, which is a hypersonic session titled Math 3 and Beyond. The ground rules remain the same. At the end of the session, there will be a Q&A session. And for the Q&A session, you are requested to type your questions in the chat box as was done in the first session of the day. This session is being chaired by Professor Sanu Kainikara, who is the Royal Australian Air Force's Air Power Strategist at the Air Power Development Centre. He is a former fighter pilot of the Indian Air Force, a graduate of the National Defence Academy, Defence Services Staff College, and College of Air Warfare. After serving 21 years in the Indian Air Force, he took premature retirement and thereafter worked as a senior analyst of a US training team in the Middle East, specializing in military strategy before moving on to Australia. He is the author of 22 books and a number of papers with focus on military strategy and air power challenges. Apart from his many other distinguished portfolios, he is currently an adjunct professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. Over to you, sir, for conducting this session.
Thank you very much, Chow. I hope everybody can hear me from so far away. Thank you.
Loud and clear, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. And before I say anything else, I must request the senior serving and retired officers in the audience to pardon me for not acknowledging them individually, since I really do not have visibility of who's attending and who's not. So please accept my apologies, sirs. At the outset, again, I must express my gratitude to Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, the additional DG of CAPS, and the central figure in today's events for asking me to chair this session of the webinar on Mark III and beyond. Thank you, Manmohan, for this opportunity to interact with the current crop of what I would call as the spear tip of the Indian Air Force. It's always a pleasure to return to home base however long the absence. So to this session, Mark III and beyond. From its developmental phase itself, the MiG-25, codenamed Foxbat by the NATO, has been an enigma, not only in India, but across the world. The MiG-25 held a few speed and altitude records, although the secrecy prevalent in the erstwhile Soviet Union precluded any further claims from being made. The interceptor variant that came into operational service with the Soviet Air Force supposedly had look down and shoot down capabilities to kill cruise missiles, and that too in the late 70s. When India procured the MiG-25R, the reconnaissance version of the aircraft, in 1981, it really made history. India was then, and continues to be, the only country to which the Soviets gave the aircraft to operate independently. The Foxbat had been seen in operations in the Middle East, particularly from Egyptian bases during the thick of the Arab-Israeli conflicts in the second half of the 20th century. However, it has been confirmed that they were operated, both flown and maintained by Soviet Air Force personnel. In IAF service, the MiG-25 continued to be shrouded in secrecy, and it's not an exaggeration to state that almost 99% of the Indian Air Force personnel never got to see the aircraft in its 2.5 decades of active service. In its home base in Bareilly, 2 concentric layers of barbed wire fencing patrolled by guard dogs kept inquisitive outsiders at bay. The missions flown by the squadron, initially formed as 102 operational unit and subsequently upgraded to 102 squadron, were covert, so much so that even spouses were unaware of the missions or the daily sorties that the squadron was flying. There is so much to say, but let's get on to the business at hand. We have 2 MiG-25R pilots here with us today. One to give you an idea of the characteristics, capabilities, and peculiarities of operating this unique aircraft, and the other to tell us about a mission which changed the perspective of the Cargill War, Operation Safed Sagar. Before I go any further, I should put to the audience a caveat. In covert operations, some issues will remain shrouded in the realm of secrecy. So while the aircraft has been phased out and a large amount of information has been declassified, some strategic issues will have to remain unannounced and unknown to most. And I'm sure both the speakers will have to work within these 2 parallel lines. I will first introduce Air Marshal Sumit Mukherjee, who's going to be the first presenter. Air Marshal Mukherjee was born on 26 June 1951 in New Delhi, a product of Sherwood College, Nainital. He graduated from the MBA in 1970 and was commissioned into the IAF on 22nd Jan 1972. He is a qualified flying instructor, Cat A, a fighter combat leader, and a graduate of the Defense Services Staff College. He was also on the faculty of the DSSC for some time. He is one of the very few officers of the IAF to have commanded 3 operational fighter squadrons or units. Now, more than that, Air Marshal Mukherjee is the only pilot in the history of the IAF, and perhaps in the history of the world, to have commanded units with the MiG-21, MiG-23U, the MiG-25, MiG-27, and the MiG-29 aircraft. His first command was a MiG-29 squadron, his second a MiG-25 squadron, and the third the Tactics and Air Combat Development Establishment, of which he was also the Commodore Commandant for 5 years as an Air Marshal. He has also commanded an operational airbase in the deserts of Western India and has over 3,500 hours of flying on fighter aircraft. He was awarded the Shaurya Chakra for gallantry at peacetime in 1981 and the Vishish Seva Medal in 97. He has been the air attaché in the Embassy of India in Washington, D.C., and has held staff appointments at Air Headquarters and Ministry of Defense. He was a senior staff officer at Headquarters Central Air Command from 2007 to 8 and was the AOCNC personnel at Air Headquarters. Air Marshal Sumit Mukherjee was appointed AOCNC Southern Air Command on 1st September 2009, and on 1st Jan 11 he was appointed Honorary Air ADC to the President of India, and on 26 Jan 2011 he was awarded the Param Vishisht Seva Medal in recognition of his lifetime achievements and distinguished service of the most exceptional order. Air Marshal Mukherjee retired from the IAF on 30th June 2011 after almost 40 years of dedicated service. On a more personal note, Sumit and I served together in 102 Squadron, flying the MiG-25 hours between 1982 and 84. In fact, looking back at those days, I am reminded of the time when the then Chief of Air Force, Air Chief Marshal Dilbagh Singh, visited the squadron sometime in early 1984. The squadron was then being commanded by Wing Commander Don Lazarus, GRC. Sumit was the senior flight commander, and I was the second flight commander. The squadron was obviously at that time the latest acquisition of the Indian Air Force, but Don Sir had been promoted to Wing Commander only about 6 months prior to his taking over. Sumit had been a squadron leader for about a year, and I, being 6 months junior to him, was a squadron leader of just 6 months vintage. I'm sure at that time we were the youngest senior leadership in any operational squadron at that time. Although Sumit is 6 months or one post senior to me, the two of us had literally grown together in the Indian Air Force. Needless to say, it's great to be back together, Sumit, albeit in a different, slightly different circumstances. Sumit, over to you. Before you start, Sumit, I would like to ask you a question. Some years back, you did an interview with an international publication, and I read that with great interest. They asked you how best you would describe the MiG-25 in one short sentence, and you said, "Catch me if you can." It's so true. I agree. What else can you say to our people?
Thank you, Sanu, for the elaborate introduction, and I'm greatly honored. It was a 20-ton aircraft that carried tons of fuel and flew in the stratosphere, cruised at 2.4 Mach at minimum reheat or afterburner, and could reach 3 Mach if so required. It was an awesome aeroplane. But before I get on to any performance details thereafter, let me just show a few photographs so that the audience is capable. There's a limitation of the webinar. The audience is clear as to what exactly the aircraft entails. Okay, can everybody see it on the screen? Yeah, only the airplane.
Yes, we all can see.
I mean, that's I think big enough, and that's the monster we're going to be talking about. And this has obviously been taken with a zoom lens because you wouldn't like to anywhere close to the airplane at this stage when it's on the takeoff roll. These were the intakes to give you all an idea as to what actually generated the performance. And this was the sort of intakes, they were big, I'm not very big. I'm 5'6" tall, and I could stand in the intake with a little bit of a crouch. So this is about 5 feet in size, which is massive for any aircraft. These were the exhausts, also huge, and this is all taken from the internet. These pictures. So it's a fighter aircraft which is shown with pylons. We didn't have the pylons in our aircraft, but the places were there for those pylons, but they were not fitted. And this is what the exhaust looked like. And in between the two fins is the tail chute. This is also what the exhaust was used for, really. And it shows you the size of the exhaust. The technicians are sitting inside, and it was a method of taking the technicians from one place to another in case they were going some distance. You all can see the ventral tank below the aeroplane, and that ventral tank, for people who are not in the know, was actually almost a MiG-23 in the belly. The quantum of fuel in the ventral tank was almost the same as the internal fuel of a MiG-23. That's another picture with the ventral tank, and that's the aircraft shown there. Here's the trainer, a very peculiar design, and we can talk about it later if there are any questions on it. And where the trainee actually sat at the back, on the rear, on top, upstairs and downstairs, and so the instructor sat below and on the nose. This was the last flight of the MiG-25 at Bareilly, and this is taxiing in after this last flight, and it was phased out in 2006. This is a comparative picture of the MiG-25 and the Su-30. They're virtually the same size. It's just the difference in the intakes that makes the MiG-25 look so much bigger. And otherwise, lengthwise and wingspan, etc., very, very similar. To give you all an idea of the sort of dress we wore, which I'll be talking about a little later, this is a pressure suit, and I shall talk about it a little later. As you can see, it's a tight fit, and there were these pipes running all over the body, along the back, and the arms, the legs, and the laces. You can see the laces which tighten the suit even further after the fit, which is a body fit absolutely. And you had needed to tighten the thing. You can see the helmet. It's a big helmet. It's not the normal flying helmet that the other pilots wear. That's a pressure helmet for you. And this is another view. One is the model on the left, and the other one is good old Chandy Verma. And this is what the pilot really looked like in the pressure suit and the helmet. And we shall talk about it a little later. So that's that for the pictorials.
Sumit, can you tell the audience something about the performance of the MiG-25?
Yeah. Yes. So it was a beast with immense power, and two Trumansky engines, R-15 Bay as they were called, each produced 13,000 kgs of thrust, which was a lot of thrust that we got out of the aircraft. Just to give you an idea of the sort of power that the aircraft generated. Most aircraft fly, you climb at a speed of, at whatever speed, at a set TS, true airspeed, with a reducing indicated airspeed as the altitude increases. Conversely, the MiG-25 climbed at constant IAS with an accelerating TAS, which was the most unusual thing about the aircraft, and that's the power that is generated by the aircraft. She climbed at a phenomenal speed of 1,050 kilometers per hour. And to give you a rough idea of the sort of performance, after takeoff, if you had to do a reciprocal turn and turn around through 180 degrees, you would be abeam the takeoff dumbbell at a height, you're crossing 30,000 feet at that stage, and crossing a speed of 1.1 Mach. That is the sort of performance. And then she would keep climbing. And what we did was to level off, we would come back on power to minimum reheat, minimum afterburner, so that the inertia finally leveled her out. And the computers allowed the aircraft to settle down to an altitude which was compatible with its fuel weight and the density altitude, so that you now got a cruising speed of around 2.4 Mach and settled at minimum reheat and in those conditions. If I didn't come back on the minimum into minimum afterburner, she would be crossing 65,000 feet with a rate of climb of 100 to 110 meters per second in those rarefied atmospheric conditions, which is actually the same rate of climb of a MiG-21 at sea level. So that is performance. Now you cruise at 20 kilometers, 65, 70,000 feet with minimum afterburner, which will actually peculiarly give the best specific fuel consumption, or SFC. And you could execute turns with about 50 degrees bank was a comfortable thing without losing height, a touch of power. The autopilot was coupled with the systems to generate what we learned in aerodynamics as little m equal to 1, which is the best settings for range. And that's what the aircraft flew. And so typically, as the fuel reduced, when the aircraft will continue to cruise climb gently all the time. And if you started at around 19.5, 20 kilometers, you ended the mission at a height of about 22 kilometers or so, roughly. That was the performance of the aircraft.
It's definitely very complex, especially when a layman is listening to you. How's the pilot workload in it?
Well, it's amazing that we had virtually a first generation navigation system, inertial navigation system, which functioned autonomously or coupled with the RSB and ground beacon for an update as and when available. One could actually engage the autopilot at 50 meters after takeoff. Your wheels have just gone up and you could engage the autopilot, take your hands off the controls. She would accelerate to 1050 IAS and commence climb and set course, execute the entire mission, including photography, and start back and come back to the designated airfield for a landing, right down to a height of 50 meters again for all hands off if you so wanted to do. All you had to do was operate the throttle, which was manual. And what we did was we used the throttle to bring it back to minimum as we reached the altitude. And then when we are returning to base, about 350 kilometers from base, you throttle back to idle. Now the aircraft would glide in idle power settings from 350 kilometers away all the way down to the base. And then you came down to 50 meters and you opened up 75% RPM, which is the landing RPM, to touch down and land. That is the sort of profile. And the inertial navigation system, first generation, as I said, but it had an accuracy of 10 kilometers off track over a distance of range of 1,000 kilometers. And when you're operating at a height of 20 kilometers and more, and you have a camera swath which is looking 90 kilometers, you'd never missed a strategic target. It was within the 20 kilometer, 30 kilometer of your center cameras. And so you always got your target, and which were all strategic in nature.
With this kind of altitude and speed capabilities, I think everyone would be wanting to ask you, were you detectable by radar? Were you susceptible to interception when you did your missions?
Yes and no, in the sense that we were detectable by radar, certainly. But you see, essentially, we operated very covertly. We operated in peacetime more than in time. We have had instances which will be the next session, but basically the job was covert. And what you did was you took off and normal flying was on, and so there are other aircraft that the radar controllers picking up, and one more blip would come up in the air, and then one blip would transit out and exit the radar scope pretty soon. A blip got missing suddenly, and this is because of the speed and at which you transited into a very high altitude. At those altitudes, depending on where the radar was positioned, you actually operated in the higher fringes of any radar in its normal look-up range, in the upper lobe of the radar, as one knows. And the ingress and egress, radar lobe and out of a radar lobe, was so fast because of the speed. The controller got maybe 2, maybe 3 blips at best to assimilate and order the interception. If a guy was not airborne, the chances of being intercepted were remote because you didn't get the time. And even if he had early warning, and you see, that was the only weapon that we had. No armament, no radar warning receiver, nothing on board. The only weapon you had was altitude, height, and speed. But if somebody knew about the secrecy, broke your secrecy and learned about the mission, and they had an aircraft coming up for you, it could look up and shoot up from a height of about 45, 50,000 feet, look up and shoot up if it knew and if it was head on. The moment you give a crossing sort of speed or an aspect to aircraft, chances were absolutely minimal that anyone would be able to catch you at that stage.
It really sounds, invincible sort of. So what were the limitations of that?
Well, the fuel quantity, I guess. The fuel was never much. 20 tons sounds a lot. It isn't much because the engines were gas guzzlers. And we had fuel in the fins, incidentally. I mean, not many aircraft carry fuel in the fins. We carried fuel in the fins. And but in the neighborhood that we operated, say Pakistan, the areas of China that were required to be seen, were all within the limitations of the quantum of fuel that one carried. But it was less, it was low, because we always came back from a mission, any supersonic mission, even the training ones for that matter, very low fuel states, 200 to 400 kgs of fuel. And to give you an idea, to do one circuit and landing was, you required 200 to 250 kgs. So you were always critical. So when a MiG-25 came in for a landing, all the landing airfield was closed for all other traffic, so that you got the priority, because you never had the option to go around again in case you missed the runway. Maybe you had an option if you had more than 250 kgs, but then you would be landing with zero fuel. So we operated rather critically as far as the fuel is concerned.
What does from a, you talked about the aircraft and its capabilities. Can you explain to the younger pilots listening to this, what does it feel like operating in the stratosphere?
Well, first and foremost, the sky is no more blue. And one grows up, and even as an aviator, when you're flying around, the sky is blue. As you transit 50,000 feet or so, you start all the little part water vapor and sunlight, and which actually give you the blue color, the hue in the sky, they start dissipating. So because of the dissipation and thereafter the virtual disappearance when you reach outer space, which is black, so the transition period, the stratospheres where we operated, was gray. So there were shades of gray, and as you past 50,000 feet, the gray started. And it became into really dark gray when you went into the dizzying heights of 90,000 and 100,000 feet. It was, you flew with the cockpit lights on as for night flying. And you had the sun, you had the moon, you had the stars. If you looked down, you saw sunlight on the ground. It was a little eerie actually, but well, it was wonderful, an experience for a lifetime.
You showed some photographs of the pressure suit, which is the one that was actually owned by Yuri Gagarin when he went to space. So, can you explain as to why you needed that to go into this sortie missions? I mean, into the mission profiles, and how effective was it?
Yeah, it's really a partial pressure suit, not an absolute pressure suit that the space astronauts use, but it was, I think, what Yuri Gagarin wore, maybe a slight modification. So it was really first generation. Yuri Gagarin went into space in 1960. These aircraft were out in the market thereafter, shortly thereafter. But as you all saw, it was a very tight body fit. You needed silk inners first for the suit to slide up your body. Otherwise, you couldn't wear the suit. So you had these long johns and a top, a full sleeve top, which was silk. And on that, you slid this thing. Now, because it was tight, you needed somebody to help you into the suit. And somebody, we have the technicians who would come, they would fit you into the suit. And thereafter, once you zip up, and please visit the washroom before you do zip it up any further, because you couldn't do anything more thereafter. Once you zipped up, thereafter the technician pulled the laces. You saw some laces all around to make it even tighter. So it was till it became a little uncomfortable. You were able to breathe, but you were reasonably uncomfortable at that stage. But that was it. The helmet weighed 2.5 kgs. But for the helmet to come on and lock, there was a neck ring and a rubber bladder which came on your neck, more not very different to like a condom. And then this helmet came on top and locked, and that was it. That gave you the partial pressure. All breathing was pressure breathing. So one had to get used to that sort of a lifestyle of using the oxygen. And you put on the system. First, it was very uncomfortable, so tight. And so you had 4 layers of clothing. You put on a lightweight flying suit over that so that the layers and all don't get entangled with the levers and the switches in the cockpit. So you had your underwear, you had the silk inner, you had the pressure suit, and you had the lightweight flying suit on top. 4 layers of clothing. Winters, very nice, comfortable. In summers, where we operated in Bareilly, 35, almost hitting 40 degrees Celsius, it was a killer. You were sweating, and I think everybody is aware of the fact that Russian aircraft have great heating systems. They don't have good cooling systems. So the air conditioning would cut in only at a height of 3,000 feet and cut out again when you're descending to 3,000 feet. And by the time you came back from a mission, you were soaked to the skin. That suit had to be peeled off your body, and so that's how we flew.
When you're flying the MiG-25s, what were your biggest fears, if I may put it that way, in terms of an emergency or something untoward would happen? Or didn't you have any fears at all?
No, if somebody said that there was no fear of flying the MiG-25, I think he's a liar. Because, we all fighter pilots, we've all flown. We've flown, and people have flown various things, and people have been into operations and all that, the fear of a gun and everything else. This was, as I said, an eerie environment. It was different. And the fact that you're flying a fuel tank, actually 20 tons of fuel. Now, if your fire warning light came on, that was terrible. And Sanu, I think you are the victim number one of this thing with the spurious fire warning, and you had to descend in a hurry. Fortunately, it kept going off and coming on, which gave you an indication that it's possibly spurious. And you made this emergency landing off base in Bakshi Ka Talab, if I'm not mistaken. On a single engine, you had to switch off that engine and come back. But you see, ejection seat on the MiG-25 is the same as that of the later version of the MiG-21 and the 23, which had two settings of 3 kilometers and kilometers, 10 and 20,000 feet. So if you're flying at 70,000 feet and you have to eject because of fire, you have a free fall of 50,000 feet before the parachute will open at 20,000 feet. Now, the ambient temperatures there were minus 85 degrees, minus 90 degrees Celsius. And then free falling, getting out in that condition where your blood can boil if you don't have the pressure suit on tight enough, and you fall 50,000 feet, it's not a very comfortable feeling. That was the fear.
Okay, we've talked about what we pilots feel and how the aircraft performs. You were the flight commander, and then subsequently, as a group captain, you commanded that squadron. What problems, if at all any, did you face in terms of maintenance practices within the unit?
The aircraft, because of its size, I guess, had already established the modular concept. Removing those huge engines was a piece of cake. It was very simple to remove the engines and change the engines. Access was available to the technicians to, get half their body inside the aircraft to work on it because of the size. And as you saw, these technicians were sitting inside the jet pipe, and the accessibility was very good to all the systems. We had, in the initial stages, as you remember, you were also there through 1 to about 84. We had problems of the tires and the fuel. The Russians refused to acknowledge the Dunlop tires and the Indian oil fuel. And so with the Iran-Iraq war going on, all this came by ship, by the Cape of Good Hope. And, we were sitting on ground for a couple of months at a time, not able to fly for shortage of these spares. And so those were the main things. The fuel was different because the normal aviation fuel all aircraft use has a specific gravity of 0.77, whereas we used a fuel that was had a specific gravity of 0.84, which gave you a higher flash point to the fuel, because the skin temperatures of the aircraft when you're operating at those altitudes goes up to 300 degrees Celsius plus. The ambient air temperature is minus 85, minus 90. The skin temperature is plus 300 degrees Celsius. You needed a different type of fuel. We also had alcohol to cool the avionics and the cameras. And most aircraft have alcohol to cool the radars and all that. And you have, these bottles which are 1 liter, 2 liter, 5 liter bottles of alcohol which spray the compartments in MiG-21 onwards. The MiG-25 carried 200 liters of alcohol one mission. That's what was the consumption. So to fill up 200 liters of alcohol, you needed a Bowser. The full Bowser, alcohol Bowsers were there to top up 200 liters of alcohol. And, the Russians provided this little tap at the end of the Bowser. You just love the Russians for this sort of thing. And people used to fill up bottles and take it home, and it was dicey, but 98 proof alcohol, but great stuff.
Sumit, no wonder you look so happy.
Sumit, we're running a little short of time, but I still want you to hopefully explain to the audience for an operational mission, what would be the approximate time frame from receipt of your tasking to the completion of photo processing or alien processing?
Yeah, it was a bit lengthy, bit long. We were first generation stuff, all the equipment and everything else. You still did your planning on the map and on pencil and scale and everything else, like all the other aircraft. And thereafter, you had to feed it on a binary, this thing onto a plate. Today's people are used to these little data cards and chips and stuff like that. We had a plate which was about 12 to 16 inches long and about 6 to 8 inches wide and about 1 inch thick. That was the data card. So you filled in that in binary, checked it on a gadget on the ground for the veracity of the navigation, the waypoints, and then you pushed it into the aeroplane, and that's what gave you the inertial navigation data and information. And so that was it. The ELINT programming would be done by the intelligence officer and all the technicians, which was done simultaneously. This planning took about 2 hours. And then going to the aircraft, the inertial navigation system erecting, a mission of 1 hour, coming back another 15-20 minutes. The whole process was about 6 hours. That's the time frame for a normal mission. Now, if you have to take the films, after you develop the films and do the quick check on the wet film and the photo interpreter would identify the targets and print only those and send them off to the source, air headquarters or wherever, command headquarters. That would take its additional time because we had no data linking those days. And so there used to be a Dornier or something positioned to carry the aircraft. The big photo reels, that big, to the destination.
And a last question for you. Can you tell us, or can you think of any specific mission that really produced exceptional results and influenced the flow?
Yeah, I think PJ will really elaborate on this because what he's flown and what he's done is something exceptional. The photographs that have come out of the Cargill area, all the mountain ridges, the crevices, the nooks, crannies, the bunkers, everything lay exposed when the MiG-25 was finally used in Cargill to pick up the targets which were not being visible because of the sort of terrain there was. And I think PJ will be the right guy. I think he's the right guy to go on to now.
Right. Thank you very much, Sumit. But I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions from the field about the performance and other things about the MiG-25. So thank you very much. I'll move on to Wing Commander PJ Thakur. Before I introduce Wing Commander Thakur, like Sumit and me, we grew up together in the Air Force. Pradeep Thakur was a cadet when I was an instructor, not my own pupil, but I checked my logbook and I have flown 2 sorties of medium level tactical with him in fighter training wing. So Pradeep, it's good to have you with us here. And Wing Commander Thakur is an alumni of the National Defense Academy, commissioned in the fighter stream in June 1980 with 125 pilots course. He did an operational conversion on the Hunter aircraft at OCU before getting posted to 2 Squadron, flew the Nat and Ajit for about 5 years before moving on to 221 Squadron, where he converted to MiG-23 BNs and flew that for 7 years in 2 tenures. In between, he underwent the flying instructor's course, did an instructional tenure at AFA, followed by the 48th Defense Services Staff College in Wellington before getting posted back to 221 for his second tenure. In 1995, you got posted to 102 Squadron and flew the MiG-25s for 4 years and undertook all the photo recce missions on the MiG-25 during Op Safed Saga, for which Pradeep was mentioned in dispatches. He did a staff tenure in Directorate of Ops Offensive at Air Headquarters Vaibhavan before taking over as Chief Instructor at the Institute of Flight Safety in Palam. He was the CFSIO at Headquarters Eastern Air Command prior to taking premature release in Jan 2004. After retirement, Pradeep worked as Chief of Flight Safety in 3 airlines and as Head of Operations in 1 airline before finally hanging up his boots in 2012 and settling down in New Delhi. And for the consumption of the audience, Pradeep has been blessed with a grandchild, a granddaughter, just yesterday. So congratulations are also due and in vogue. So Pradeep, over to you and your presentation on Ops of Faith Saga.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon to everyone. I would be basically covering the Cargill conflict. I hope you can hear me.
Come closer to the mic, Pradeep, please.
I hope I'm audible now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely fine.
Okay. Cargill conflict was an unconventional war fought in the high mountains of Kashmir. The Indian Air Force had to rapidly adapt to this air campaign's unique operational challenges, which had targets at heights from 14,000 to 18,000 feet, in a stark backdrop of rocks, snow, making visual target acquisition very difficult. This was further complicated by the small size of the enemy positions, which were so vastly dispersed in a background with snow. Further complicated that the individual positions were small, generally well concealed, and I would like to say resistance to visual acquisition and targeting. Added to that, the Himalayas tended to obscure the enemy from aerial observation, even to the extent of masking effects of bomb detonations, rendering even near misses ineffective. I could really put myself in the boots of the strike pilots and understand the difficulty they were facing, having myself been a part of the main strike squadron over the Siachen Glacier, flying the MiG-23BNs in the late 80s, early 90s. I had flown enough over the glacier, also practiced air-to-ground range work at our ranges at Tosha Maidan and Katso, but they were at heights of 10,000 feet and 14,000 feet. The huge difference that our strike pilots were facing was that when we were dropping armament at Toshe Maidan or Katso, the ground targets were very well marked out, the attack directions profiles laid out, and no threats of shoulder-fired missiles. You must understand, for carrying out aerial attacks on ground targets, recce is very important along with bomb damage assessment. The first activity of any recce mission is to gather information about the likely targets, which would entail photographing, fixing the coordinates so that target analysis and thereafter targeting could be carried out by the fighter aircraft. Initially, during the Cargill Ops, the Air Force used a variety of sources such as satellite imagery, ARC, as well as the Jaguar with its LoRa pod. Even the Canberra was used for gathering information on these locations. Unluckily, one of the Canberra's aircraft conducting a recce mission at 22,000 feet got hit by a shoulder-fired missile close to the line of control, though he managed to come back safely and land. But this event highlighted the real threat of the shoulder-fired missiles. What was happening that the coordinates obtained from these resources appeared to be inaccurate, going by the large number of strike missions that were unsuccessful in finding targets. Now, in the absence of accurate coordinates, what the strike force actually was doing a search and strike mission, or we could put it groping in the dark and then striking. Coupled with that, because the strike force had now elevated itself to a height of 10 kilometers, the laser detection pods with a narrow field of view found it very, very difficult to first visually acquire the target and then lock onto it. Now, if you cannot visually acquire the target, there's no way you can, designate it by the laser designating pod. And there is no chance that you will be able to launch your laser guided bomb. The need of the hour, therefore, became to get accurate target location and coordinates. It was in this kind of scenario that the MiG-25 Foxbat made an entry into Operation Safed Sagar in a very innovative tactical role. Sumit Mukherjee sir has covered the performance of the MiG-25 in much detail. Even at the cost of repetition, I would like to put in something. The empty aircraft, like he said, weighed 20 tons and with full internal fuel was 35 tons. But the Foxbat had some amazing performance. From the time you release brakes on takeoff, it would climb to 20 kilometers. In the process, accelerate to 2.4 Mach in 7 minutes and 30 seconds. This was with the restriction of not going supersonic below a height of 30,000 feet or 10 kilometers. At those heights, like Muksa mentioned, the sky is not blue. It's shades of brown, becoming gray and maybe black. Stars, the sun and the moon itself both together. At 20 kilometers, 2.5 Mach, as the fuel burnt off, if you had selected a height of 20 kilometers, the aircraft would start accelerating beyond 2.4. And if you had selected a speed of 2.4 Mach, it would start climbing from 20 kilometers to 21, 22, 23. And you could do nothing about it because you could not come up of the minimum reheat till the time you drop speed to 2.2 Mach. So initially it was a little unnerving. Second thing he talked about was the thought of the ejection. From 20 kilometers, by the time you hit 6 kilometers, you have touched your terminal velocity. And then what would the parachute opening shock be? The approach, like he said, commenced from 300 to 350 kilometers from the touchdown. say at a height of 20 kilometers, 2.4 Machs. You throttle back to idle, it would decelerate to subsonic speeds. This was basically to cool down the airframe, which was at 300 degrees centigrade. At 10 kilometers, you leveled out, opened both engines to max dry to warm up the engines before continuing the approach for landing. The workload on the MiG-25 is pretty high. As he also mentioned, it was meant for recce, did not carry RW. I mean, it had no countermeasures, RWR, or guns or this thing. Its basic safety was inner element, which was to be high and fast above that is above a height of 20 kilometers to 40 miles. This was also to ensure that there was no skip or overlap in the photographs. So a certain velocity by height ratio had to be maintained. Such a flight was only suitable for imaging larger targets. In ops of Saved Sagar, it would have been impossible to pick up small targets the size of bunkers in which the enemy was holed up. Therefore, there was clearly a need of exploring a lower and slower option. We carried out a few sorties over the hills north of Bareilly, which were not at the same height, but we flew at two profiles we came down to. One was at a height of 14 kilometers, maintaining the speed of 1.3, 1.4 Mach. And the second was a height of 10 kilometers at an altitude, at 10 kilometers altitude at a speed of 0.95 Mach. The factors we took into consideration for selecting the flight profile was we wanted to pick up small targets with clarity and accuracy. The second thing, we wanted to be operating at a speed where the Mirage 2000 aircraft could escort the Foxbat. At that time, the Mirage 2000s in the air defense configuration had a restriction of 0.95 Mach. Therefore, if the Foxbat was at 1.4, they would not have been able to escort. Fuel was another critical factor. Against the first profile, that's 14 kilometers, 1.3 Mach. Even if the Mirage 2000 did not have the speed restriction on speed, it would not have been able to escort the MiG-25 beyond the first waypoint, which was in own territory. Because to maintain 1.4 Mach, the Mirage 2000 would also have to be in the afterburner regime. For all these considerations, it was decided that we fly the sortie at 10 kilometers, 0.95 Mach. But this was not without other problems. For one, like Muksa mentioned, the Foxbat guzzled fuel at this altitude. In normal missions, we would generally get airborne from a base which was deep inside our territory, carry out the mission, recover at a forward base, replenish fuel, turn around the aircraft, and then ferry back to your own base. In Survey Sagar, we didn't have this option. Adambur, which was ops location for us, was the launch base and the recovery base.
Pradeep, sorry to butt in. You got about 12, 13 minutes.
Yes, sir. For the flight, what I calculated was that I would be very critical coming back after the mission. So an en route base was chosen as a standby for diversion. Air headquarters, on their part, ensured whenever I flew a mission, I had tight escorts and 2 MiG-29 in the journey area doing combat air patrol. After I landed in Adhampur, I sat down with the planners and the strike squadrons and we worked out how we were going to undergo the mission. Basically, it's because the people in the Mirages who were there at that time had never escorted a MiG-25, and I myself had never been escorted by anybody. I flew a total of the first mission I flew was on the Cargill Drass sector. It was a main RT strike. The briefing we had between us was only in case a credible threat approached, the escorts would break silence and I would immediately turn left, engage my afterburners, commence my acceleration and climb to 20 kilometers, 2.4 Mach and head back to my base. In the first sortie, after a couple of minutes on the photo run, the escort leader broke silence and told me 2 bogies, 2 o'clock, reciprocal, no threat, continue. And after a short gap, he did give me a call again that they turned northwards, so continue. That was the only time we got any airborne threat. The rest of the photo run was completed successfully. I returned back to Adhampur. I had fuel enough to come to Adhampur. The films were downloaded, taken to Bareilly, processed, and sent to air headquarters, WAC, I really don't know. When the processed films came back to Western Air Command and Adhampur, the effect was electrifying. It was as if the fog had been lifted. All uncertainties had melted away and there was euphoria in the crew rooms. We had crystal clear images of targets of Tolling, Marpola, Mantotalo, Tiger Hill, and a huge amount. When we asked them, we said that we could pick up bunkers as small as that. It was now possible for the planners and the strike squadrons to carry out detailed analysis of the targets, visualize what the targets would look like from the release altitudes, since the MiG-25 had also flown at 10 kilometers. Plan the most appropriate attack direction and attack them with accuracy. Now the strike force was in a know and pulverize mode. And did they pulverize? I didn't carry out very many missions. I carried out 4 missions on the Cargill Drass sector and 1 on the Rajouri Poonch sector, basically to check if there was any build-up taking place on that front. One notable incident which comes to my mind is that one of the fleet aircraft, other aircraft, after photo recognition came back excited that they had picked up a huge enemy base. It had a helipad, 30, 40 tents, 2 helicopters. They thought it was Gultari, a place which was beyond the LOC. But just to make sure, before engaging, though everyone wanted to engage, we were on a war footing and a good field factor was coming in. But I was supposed to do another mission maybe next day or the day after that. So prudence said that I should fly the mission. I got airborne for the mission. Once I came where they had picked up the thing, I altered course to fly 3-4 kilometers north of the planned route. After landing, when we processed the films, it was a camp which was 13 kilometers from my track, which would have been about 8 to 9 kilometers from the LOC. So we confirmed Gultari camp, and I think a major fiasco was averted. I and the Foxbat returned back to base on the 1st August after successful completion of the assigned task in an innovative tactical recce wrote, where we did not have a single skip of the film or an overlap. I believe the role of the Foxbat in Safed Sagar was priceless, and its weight in gold. And the MiG-25 weighs quite a bit. Thank you very much. I have covered as much as I can remember. In case there are any questions, I took best of knowledge and covered it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for a very erudite explanation of the mission that you carried out. And for the audience, there's an interview that Wing Commander P.J. Thakur had done with a journalist called Shiv Arur, which is there on the YouTube as the untold story of the MiG-25 on Live Fist. So anyone who's interested, where Pradeep gives much more details than what he could in the 25 minutes that he was allocated. And now, for the past 1 hour or so, we have discussed sustained flight at Mark III and how this capability impacts, enhances, and optimizes the employment of air power to achieve national security imperatives. The next step in airborne assets would be a further increase in speed of weapon systems and delivery platforms towards going hypersonic. In a conference of this nature, I think it will be remiss of us if we do not at least make a limited foray into the world of hypersonic flight, the beyond in this session's title, Mark III and Beyond. Most of you would have seen a report mid-2020, I think it was in June, which claimed that China had made record-breaking progress in manufacturing a scramjet that could significantly advance the development of China's hypersonic cruise missile, which is meant to be much more effective than China's DF-17 hypersonic glide boost missile. Similarly, all nations that have indigenous aeronautical research facilities, the US, Russia, France, India, Japan, and some more, are undertaking research into hypersonic flight. I read an article by an analyst which went on as far as to say that falling behind in hypersonic research is detrimental to national pride. So, what is hypersonic flight? Hypersonic flight refers to objects traveling at speeds in excess of Mach 5, which is approximately 3,000 knots, to about Mach 25, approximately 16,000 knots. Now, the range of the speed is such that a large number of systems fall within the scope of hypersonic flight. The potential effect of such systems on the employment of air and space power is difficult to predict because of a lack of clear understanding regarding the direction of the research and technological advancements. However, one could say with certain assurance that the effect will be both disruptive and challenging. There are two major characteristics that distinguish hypersonic weapon systems: speed and survivability. Speed reduces the time between launch and arrival at target, whether it's to neutralize the target or to arrive there. These systems have heightened survivability because of their speed, which would beat any modern, and I would go as far as to say any near future air defense systems. From these two primary characteristics stem 4 advantages of hypersonic flight that directly enhance air power capabilities. First, the concept of global reach takes on a completely different meaning, and perhaps more importantly, distance loses its defensive connotation. Second, hypersonic flight will force the compression of the decision cycle, since the time between the decision to act and the realization of the desired effect reduces drastically with hypersonic flight. Third, hypersonic weapon systems, if applied optimally, will be able to neutralize multiple centers of gravity in a very short span of time, thereby greatly increasing the collective and cumulative effect that can be created on the adversary. And the fourth advantage is that hypersonic flight and weapon systems will enhance the effectiveness of joint and integrated operations towards which all modern military forces are gravitating. I'm only giving you a kind of a dot point brief. We can discuss this if there is time later. These 4 advantages that I mentioned are all apparent at the operational level of war and at the operational level of command. However, hypersonic flight also has impacts at the strategic level of national security, primarily in 2 aspects. One, nations will be forced to change their basic national security posture, dependent on whether or not they possess hypersonic weapon systems. In addition, the haves, the nations that have hypersonic weapons, will realize that the strategies of deterrence and coercion will gain predominance in the overall national security calculus. The second strategic impact is on force structure planning. Force structure planning for the military at the highest levels of decision making will need to be done concurrent with developments in technological research. That is not what is happening at the moment. And this will need a drastic change in the thinking process towards force structure planning. And realistically, this process should be able to balance unfounded optimism regarding these weapon systems and also ill-considered denial of emerging technologies. In this case, sustained hypersonic flight. So from a futuristic point of view, I really want to emphasize the most important aspect of operationalizing hypersonic capabilities. The absolute necessity to adapt the decision-making capabilities at all levels of command. Because essentially what is going to happen is that your decision-making time reduces to almost nothing. That's one. The compressed timeline for making operational decisions and the responses will demand a step change in the tools made available to support decision-making process. From a force design perspective, this demand will be for improvement in the capability of the force to sense, comprehend, and act within this reduced time frame that is available to you, to ensure that decision superiority is retained. The day we lose decision superiority, we lose the war, we lose the battle, we lose the skirmish. In force design, the principal design consideration will become the need to increase responsiveness and to reduce latency. The ripple effect of true hypersonic capabilities will be felt maximum in the field of ISR. From what I have said, you can see that from in the ISR world. In fact, I would go to the extent of stating that enhanced ISR capabilities will be the cornerstone of optimizing hypersonic capabilities. From an ISR perspective, there are 3 requirements that we must meet in order to ensure optimization of this hypersonic air power as and when it comes into being. 1, the need to have enhanced range. The global reach of hypersonic weapon systems would automatically mean that there would be a requirement for a corresponding expansion of the ISR umbrella. 2, the need for multi-domain integration. The sensor networks across all domains, land, sea, air, space, cyber, will have to be integrated by design to provide near real-time information for the use of these weapon systems. 3, the need to become artificial intelligence enabled. The reduction in reaction time in hypersonic warfare will make the human decision-making process redundant. I can go out on a limb and say this. At all levels of command, artificial intelligence enabled decision making will have to be introduced and thereafter optimized if we are to optimize the hypersonic capabilities that will come. So very briefly, I just want to once again point out what will happen to the four air power roles. While the fundamental concept of control of the air, the ability to do something in or through the air without enemy interference, will remain the same, definitely. But the manner in which it is achieved would change dramatically, disruptively. While point defense and caps will become redundant, the OCA and DCA, offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air that we talk about today, will merge into one single counter-air mission as far as hypersonics is concerned. And at the operational level, the higher speed and attached better survivability of hypersonic weapon systems would obviate actually the need to fight to control the air. We won't need to do that. So control of the air will be required, but the manner in which we achieve that will change completely. As far as the second role, strike, is concerned, it will become more rapid, assured, and obviously that will give the commander much greater flexibility. ISR umbrella will have to expand dramatically. There's no question about that. Both for protection from hypersonic attack and for optimizing one's own hypersonic attack capabilities. The requirement will be for expanded capabilities and the ability to provide near real-time information to the commander. So the ISR hub is where expansions, changes, technological developments have to take place. And in terms of air mobility, which is the fourth core role that I consider, at hypersonic speeds would perhaps be the lowest priority in terms of technological developments. But as and when it comes about increased responsiveness, like what Manmohan said in his presentation, of air logistics support missions will have a cascading effect on all joint operations. So to sum up this hypersonic thing, I will just point out two risks and one possible opportunity that will come with the introduction of hypersonic capabilities into a military force. First, the strategic risks. Once a nation has confirmed the introduction of such a capability, it has the potential to start an arms race, both regionally and globally. The second risk, it could drive security planning and national posture. Excuse me. It could drive security planning and national posture towards preventive and preemptive strikes, preemptive actions, pursuing the extremes in the strategies of deterrence and coercion, which will become paramount. The only opportunity that I could think of that the introduction of hypersonic systems would produce for a nation is that it would reduce the cost, probably, of space access and exploration. Otherwise, at the strategic level, I do not see an opportunity coming, but there are risks involved in terms of when you relate this whole capability to national security. So this is an overview of the impact of assured hypersonic flight and hypersonic weapon systems on the enhancement of air power as a critical element of national power. The topic is actually very vast, and we can discuss it and debate it at length. But at the moment, with the time that we've got, that's not a possibility. So without further ado, I will throw open the floor to questions for the two presenters, Air Marshal Mukherjee and Wing Commander Thakur. Over to you, Chow.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that wonderful analysis and taking us from the past, from the MiG-25 to the present, onto hypersonics. A question from AVM Bahadur to the chair is, are we looking at accidents due to high trigger alert that would perhaps become the norm?
Sorry, I didn't get the question once more.
So the question is, are we looking at accidents due to high trigger alert that would perhaps become the norms with hypersonics coming in?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That's where I went to the strategic level of preemptive and preventive strikes. The chances of a misadventure increases with the speed at which you can create an effect. That's a standard problem. The longer the distance between the act and the effect, the easier it is to contain. The shorter the distance between the two, the chances of escalation and chances of misadventure, as we call it, much higher. And that is one thing that has to be kept in mind. And that is one of the reasons why I have introduced the question of artificial intelligence induced decision making, or artificial intelligence enabled decision making. The normal human being decision making will not be able to contain a wrong decision. We'll put it that way.
Thank you, sir. There is a question from 45 Wing for Air Marshal Mukherjee. The question is, there are inputs that the MiG-25 was committed to land at large distances on approach. So he wants some inputs on the approach management and the engine response during the landing routes.
As I said that you came down with your throttle to idle all the way from 350 kilometers, and with a little warming up the engine in between, and for a brief minute, and you continued in a glide all the way through till approach. On that, your approach actually started 15 kilometers from base, really, which is quite large for most of the aircraft. She's very heavy, one can imagine, and corrections on approach were tricky in the sense that till you got used to it, it had a lot of inertia, and she would wallow on the approach if you were not careful. But otherwise, she was rock steady, and it was just at 75% RPM, which is, I think, a very standard RPM for most Russian aircraft. From MiG-21s onwards, the 75% RPM on final approach is around about there for landing. With those, the takeoff speed was 340 kilometers per hour, and the landing speed 320, 310. So the threshold speed. You could actually, you would stop by the middle marker with your tail chute. You have two tail parachutes, and so you would stop by the middle marker. We have executed where you really come down at the lowest possible speed, and you actually deploy the chute as you're touching down, and you could actually stop the two markers with the 600 yards. Notwithstanding the weight and momentum, the aircraft could handle that way on the approach and landing.
Thank you, sir. There's a question from Dr. Manpreet Sethi of CAPS to the chair. The question is, there are many analysts who are divided on the military utility of hypersonics versus its impact on strategic stability. Any thoughts on the cost of hypersonics arsenal building vis-a-vis their military utility?
Hi, Manpreet. Long time since I spoke to you. The question of cost-benefit analysis is always something that military forces have to face. Whether the hypersonic systems are going to be so expensive and that most of them would be a one-time use, not a reusable system, at least in the initial stages of their introduction. So whether it's going to be a cost-effective way or not is always a question that we ask. The advantages of the hypersonic weapon systems or a strike system, I'm not talking about a delivery mechanism. I'm now talking about, let's say, a hypersonic missiles. I think the assurance of success in terms of creating the effect that you need would perhaps outweigh the cost balance that you're talking about, because there would be at some stage an acceptance of the necessity for a nation to be able to strike at centers of gravity across the globe or around the globe or the centers of gravity of an adversary in an assured manner and in a short period of time. That from the time I say act to the time that that target is neutralized and the effect created, I would think that that would outweigh the cost factor, at least to create a small, a small lot of these missiles. Whether they can be thereafter leveraged to use for space exploration and things like that, which is supposed to be peaceful, I really don't know. Like I said in the end of my presentation, that that's the only opportunity that I could think about and I could read about in some places. Not really. I'm personally not convinced that that connection will be made, but there will be nations that will spend the necessary money to have a small arsenal of this of these missiles.
Thank you, sir. Probably a question from 43 Wing to Wing Commander Thakur, sir. The question is, a platform like the MiG-25, with the kind of sensors that are available today, is a platform like MiG-25 still relevant today, sir?
I think it's absolutely relevant today also, in the sense that, tell me an aircraft in our subcontinent which would cope up with the capabilities of the MiG-25. Like Muksa said, that if you want to intercept it, you got to be at 50,000 feet. And an aircraft climbing to 50,000 feet would be picked up by our radars also. I would get a warning. I needed to alter course by 5 degrees. From a head-on mode, I can promise you, I go into a tail-on mode. And there is no way I could be taken out of the sky. I think it's very relevant. Unluckily, with the satellites coming in, with the UAVs coming in, they've taken over the part of the MiG-25. I hope I've answered your question. Or
You've done that, sir. Thank you so much. And over to you, Chair, for summing up, sir.
Sir,
Yeah.
sir, if there is a question from 102 Trisonics, so I don't think we should leave that, though they have changed aircraft. This question is from, I think, Flight Lieutenant Anchit Nair. I think he's from 14 Wing, so it must be 102. My question to the veterans, you have spoken enough about the performance. How about shedding some light on the capture of the solar eclipse? Sir, maybe just 2 minutes because after that the chair has to close.
That's Sumit.
Yes, sir.
Okay, 1995 total solar eclipse. We were tasked by headquarters because some scientists from the Udaipur Solar Observatory wanted to do some experiments of the solar corona around the sun at the time of the eclipse. So we did this mission. I did it in the trainer with the rear seat and the upper one, which is actually the pilot. We fitted this Hasselblad camera, which was huge. The scientists never realized that you can't fit a camera that big, but we fitted it. Now, having fitted it, you can't see anything in front. So we needed to fly it in the trainer. So I had my flight commander in front of me, front seat to do the takeoff and the landing. And we devised a little gun sight with graph paper. You know, people have forgotten graph paper nowadays. And a little pinhole we made with the pin and fabricated that. We had to do a lot of tests. We had NASA charts, and we had we rigged the aeroplane to get the flying conditions. We flew at a height of 33 kilometers and speed of 2.5 Mach or so, a little more. And we flew in the center of the shadow, and the place designated was a place called Ramka Tila or something near Agra. And so I fed into the shadow of the path of the eclipse, sorry, before the eclipse came, because the eclipse was actually traveling at 1500 meters per second. And so I fell into the path and waited for the eclipse to come. So we've taken, we started doing the photography, and those days that camera was which was fitted on the aircraft was, I think, 25 frames per second or something, Hasselblad. And we started filming before as the eclipse started till the eclipse finished. On the ground, people saw the eclipse for 41 seconds. Maximum in the center of the path. We saw it for 2 minutes 30 seconds because we were traveling at 2.5 along with the eclipse. And so we've got some fantastic pictures which are all given to the observatory. And there's this fantastic starburst picture that I have. That's the only thing I got. Rather than the diamond ring, which is so common one sees, but there's a starburst when the sun starts to break through the little crevices and the hills on the moon, on the surface of the moon. It's a fantastic picture. This is sort of a starburst one doesn't get to see. That was the solar eclipse.
So for everyone's information, we did the same thing in 1999 after the Cargill operations out of Jamnagar, sir.
Over to the chair for summing up, sir.
Thank you so much, Chow, for handling those questions. I would like to request the audience to put your hands together virtually to presenters who gave us a very clear picture of how it was to operate the aircraft, as well as how it was utilized in an extremely unconventional manner, but with great results. Thank you so much, Sumit and Pradeep. Thank you.
And to the chair too.
Thank you. I have nothing more to say. This talk about the